Welcome everybody to our webinar. Good afternoon. I'm John McDermott. I'm Vice President of Reimbursement, Health Economics, and Market Access here at MCRA. And we have a great session lined up for you today. We're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of Category III CPT codes, and we're also going to cover the process of converting them over to Category I. Next slide. And so I'll have a brief introduction, then we'll look how do you get Category III codes and what do you do with them after you have them, converting to Category I. Then we have a few small brief topics on Category III. Then I think an important part you may be interested in, we have some guidance on what should you do to support your Category III codes once you have them throughout the whole process to converting to Category I. Then some key takeaways. And we hope to have time for some Q&A at the end of the session. Okay, next slide. Now, before we get started, I wanted to do just a brief introduction of MCRA, our firm. We are now an IQVIA business, and we are a global CRO and integrated medical device advisory firm. We have a deep therapeutic specialization. We cover most of the different therapy areas out there. And we have very experienced consultants in all of our different service lines. Okay, next slide. And as I said, we work together. We have a medical device focused global CRO that can design and execute medical device clinical studies anywhere. We have a very strong regulatory function featuring many leaders who came over to us directly from the FDA. I co-lead our reimbursement function, and we have comprehensive services from early market assessments through regular coverage coding, payment, reimbursement strategy, CMS outreach projects. We have an evidence and health economics function. We can help you with clinical trial reimbursement services. We also provide reimbursement hotlines and patient access programs. And we also have a service line that does outreach and advocacy with payers to try to establish coverage. In addition to those services, we also have quality assurance and staffing, healthcare compliance, cybersecurity, investor due diligence, and we also have an AI and imaging center to help with clinical research with those types of products. Okay, next slide. And then just briefly on logistics, if you have a question, please submit it in the bar at the top of the webinar screen or put it in the chat. We will be providing access to a recording of the webinar, and we'll also make available a copy of the slides. And then finally, there'll be a follow-up email where you can contact any of the presenters through that, or just simply emailing info@micra.com. Okay, next slide. And now I'd like to introduce my other presenters. So first is Chaya Chavez. She's a professional coder. And Chaya, why don't you tell them about some of your coding background?
Hi, so I'm Chaya Chavez. I'm the Associate Director of Coding here at MCRA. I help perform our coding assessments and do coding strategy and help put together new code applications. Prior to coming to MCRA, I worked over 20 years in coding leadership in several hospital systems in the Pacific Northwest. I helped with both understanding and leading those teams with billing and coding functions in various specialties. And so Category III is a place that's near and dear to my heart, and it's an honor to be on this webinar today.
Thank you, Chaya. And we're also joined by our special guest, Dr. Joel Brill. Many of you may know him. He's, I guess, among the industry's foremost experts in CPT. But Dr. Brill, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of your CPT experience?
Sure, John. First off, thank you very much to MCRA and IQVIA to invite me to this webinar this afternoon. I've had over a quarter of a century experience in CPT coding and have also been involved in the RUC process as well as an advisor. I've also been a health plan medical director. So that affords me the opportunity to take a look at things from a coding coverage as well as a reimbursement perspective. Again, delighted to be with you all here today.
Great. Thank you both. Okay, next slide. So I thought it would be appropriate to have Chaya kick us off as a professional coder with her take on what I think of as the golden rule of code selection.
Yeah, so, one of the biggest things we hear from our clients is, do we need new codes? So that's one of the biggest questions that we first need to ask is, are there existing codes that meet the need for your technology? So the AMA created this standard that we go by. So that is that you can't just pick a CPT code if it merely approximates the service that's provided. So if a code description does not exist that meets your technology's description, then the AMA advises that you use an unlisted code. Well, unlisted codes, as you might know, are kind of a miscellaneous or generic code that really just it doesn't have great payment, and it's not a great long-term solution. So when you fall into this category, really the only long-term coding solution that is viable is to pursue a new code.
Yep. Thank you, Chaya. And next slide. And that leads us then into Category 3. And I think the first question I have for my co-presenters here is, how did Category 3 come about, and what is the history of Category 3? And Chaya, do you want to lead us off first?
Yeah, so I can share about that. So back in 2001, there were a lot of new technologies, and they really didn't fit the criteria required for a Category 1 code. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But really, so there were all these technologies that just really didn't have a place to fit in the current CPT language. So the AMA created what are called T codes, or Category 3 codes. These are what some people refer to by T codes as either temporary or tracking codes. So they're meant to only last a certain period of time, usually about 5 years, and then they need to be renewed. But these are essentially for tracking purposes so that the AMA can know who is using these codes, what they're using them for, and how much are they charging. So essentially, they have a way of tracking specific technology and understanding the costs and resources associated with those charges. Now, in 2016, when the 21st Century Cures Act was created, that kind of changed up the game. So it wasn't actually effective until 2019, but when it became effective, the Medicare administrative contractors could no longer issue a blanket non-coverage policy for Category 3 codes. So this really made it so that they couldn't just blanket say, we're not going to pay for these. And the payers had to actually issue an individual policy for each individual decision on a claim. This really helped technologies that had Category 3 codes. I remember before this happened, I would talk to providers and they were really afraid to even use these codes because they knew it just meant I'm not going to get paid. Well, this 21st Century Cures Act really changed that, and it became now where Category 3 codes are a much more plausible solution. And now you can even see them on the Medicare fee schedules.
Yep. Thank you, Chaya. And Joel, I know you were involved when Category 3 came online. Was that a difficult process to get this new class of codes established?
So, like anything, change happens slowly. This was clearly a well-researched and well-thought-out process by the AMA before they elected to create Category 3 codes. but they were doing that in part to respond to a need that had been expressed by a variety of stakeholders. And that the original concept was indeed to be able to track emerging technologies and use these codes in order to better understand them, because as Chaya said earlier, an unlisted code is not otherwise specified, so you didn't know exactly what was being performed. And also the thought process was that by having these codes that could be tracked, it could then serve as a bridge to demonstrate utilization as one of the tenets for eventually seeking a Category I CPT code.
Thank you, Joel. Okay, so I think that's our intro. Let's move on to the next slide. And now we want to spend a little bit of time on the Category III process. And there are multiple steps here. It begins with, I guess, planning your strategy and then developing the specific coding nomenclature that you're going to put in the application. There's an element of specialty society outreach. There's a public meeting. Then there's a special process the AMA has for communicating the decisions. There's also a consideration for getting the new code assigned to an APC, which is something not a lot of people are aware of. It's extremely important. And then all of this is happening in advance of the actual code launch itself. So I think to get started, Teresa, why don't you go to the next slide for me? So let's look at the criteria first. So Chaya, why don't you walk us through how do you qualify to get a Category III code?
Yeah, so there isn't a lot of eligibility criteria for Category III. Really, all you have to do is demonstrate that the procedure is currently or recently being performed in humans, and then one of these other things. So, you can look through these on your own as well, but really, you need to have society support and you need to have evidence to support your procedure as well. So the evidence for Category III is not as strict as Category I.
Thank you, Chaya. And, we always talk about starting things early. Joel, a question for you. How early would you recommend that companies get started when they're considering applying for a Category III code?
So when a company is first starting to develop its strategy around speaking with the FDA, that's when they should also be thinking about their publication strategy. And when they're thinking about their publication strategy, they should start thinking about the planning as to what their CPT coding strategy will be. Remember that what a company needs to get to the FDA to show that something is safe and effective might not necessarily be what's needed to demonstrate that something is reasonable and necessary. And also, John, as I think you and many who are attending here may know, is that there may even be some certain circumstances where Medicare could cover an investigational device even before FDA clearance. And for that, having a Category III code may be part of that strategy. So I think it all comes down to when should you be thinking about your coding strategy? I'd probably say about a day prior to when you're thinking about reaching out to the FDA and thinking about that strategy.
Okay, thank you, Joel. One thing to point out on the criteria here, sometimes these get, at least they've confused me in the past, we've color coded them here because if you just see it in text, it's not always clear, but you need at least the procedure or the device to be used in humans. So if you're just in preclinical or animal testing, you're not going to qualify for Category III. And then you need one of the next three criteria here. So you need a society member or clinical literature in English on the actual or the potential clinical efficacy, because they do understand this may be an investigational device at this point. And then, or if you don't have that, then at least an IRB approved clinical study protocol in the US. So one of those, and then you need a description of a current or an ongoing trial, on the efficacy or other evidence of evolving clinical utilization. So when you look at that as a whole, it's really not a very high bar to meet. It's relatively straightforward. If you have a normal clinical development program or product development program going, it's usually not a big burden to meet for Category 3. Okay, let's see. Next question is, one of the elements required is specialty society outreach. And I guess I'd like to ask Joel to cover that one. What should outreach look like, and what are some landmines or pitfalls that people might encounter along the way?
Sure. So remember that for most specialty societies, you have staff members of that specialty society, and then you have physicians who are volunteers who are fitting in their job responsibilities to the society in addition to their day-to-day clinical responsibilities. So the specialty society's timeline might not necessarily be your timeline. The other thing to think about this is that from the specialty society's standpoint, they're looking at how does your request to create a code for your new technology or procedure, how does that impact other codes that that may currently exist. So oftentimes it's good to have early outreach with the staff member of the specialty society. Usually it's someone who may manage coding or reimbursement or may have some similar type of a position. Reach out to them. And sometimes staff will take an initial call with you, so it gives you a chance to discuss what you're doing. Sometimes they will then say, we have a coding committee. It may be meeting monthly or maybe meeting quarterly or some other process, and it gives you an opportunity to do a presentation. Think ahead of time. Think about creating a Gantt chart. Think about when your goal is to submit a CPT application and work backwards. I mean, jumping the gun, most specialty societies would like 6 to 8 weeks in order to review a CPT application. So if an application deadline for something is November the 1st, clearly you don't want to reach out to them on October the 15th and say, I've got an application, could you review it and get it back to me, and can we submit it in time? Think ahead of time, plan, educate. Your goal is to be collaborative with the society and to get them to understand why there is this need to create a code or series of codes for your new product, technology, service, and the like.
And actually, Teresa, can you go to the next slide for me? And I still want to stay on specialty societies for a minute. And Joel, it's true also that it's not necessarily just one society, right? Because in my own memory, I was involved 20 years ago getting some new codes for Botox for hyperhidrosis and migraine. And I remember being caught between the neurologists and the dermatologists. They didn't agree. But talk a little bit about, is it one or multiple societies that could be involved?
So great point. First off is that within certain societies, there may be multiple specialty societies. We see that, for example, in radiology, cardiology, gastroenterology, laboratory, and others. And then, John, is also, as you point out too, you may have a procedure that could be performed by several different societies. Perhaps a procedure might be done by general surgery and by urology or by gynecology or the like. So it's important to reach out to them simultaneously. You may find that one society might say, I will take the lead for communication amongst the other specialty societies within my specialty. And sometimes staff may even say, I'll take the lead of coordinating with the other societies as well. But again, be upfront, let them know that this is something that could be done by multiple societies, because staff is going to be your Sherpa here in guiding you in this process.
Yep. Now we've got the timelines here. So sitting today, this is this is a viable timeline here. There is a deadline also in November. So down at the bottom, you see you can apply 3 times a year, February, June, and November. But because of some of the advanced lead times required, February right now might be the most viable deadline. And the application is due. So that means you'll need to have completed your society outreach before you submit the application in February. And then there's a panel meeting in May. And I know Chaya and Dr. Brill often cover or often attend the panel meeting. But Chaya, why don't you give us your perspectives? What happens at the panel meeting?
Yeah, they're a really interesting meeting where several hundred people, get together and talk about codes all day. It sounds kind of nerdy, but those of us that go, we really enjoy it and find it fascinating. But really, it's a lot of discussion about the code applications. So sometimes in the beginning of the meeting, well, not sometimes, every time, they have what's called the consent agenda. So those are the applications that have kind of gone through the ringer prior to the meeting date, and there really isn't any opposition to those applications. So those get on kind of this list of is a desired place to be, where they can get voted on in the beginning of the meeting, and it passes through and they get their code if they're on the consent agenda. So that's really kind of a desired place to be. It doesn't always happen, but if there are questions about the application from the societies or any outside persons, then it is discussed during the meeting. So that's kind of a 2, sometimes 3-day process, this meeting where it occurs. And it can be where we discuss, all of the different applications that have been submitted and any potential questions that the CPT editorial panel has about those applications. Sometimes, all the questions are answered and the application goes through to voting, which you don't find out right away at the meeting whether or not a code is approved. We find out about 4 weeks later. But sometimes, there are additional questions, and sometimes those applications can be postponed. So it's a really interesting meeting where, you get to find out about all the new technology that has been applying for new codes, and, just really kind of understanding what is needed to get a successful code application through.
And Joel, is there a way to characterize the kinds of questions that the panel has at the meeting? In other words, do they have a specific purpose in mind for having a public discussion?
Sure. So basically, when every code application has been submitted, the code will have a primary, a secondary, and sometimes even a third reviewer as well, who are panel members. The panel primary reviewer will summarize the coding application, will summarize information with regards to the clinical literature and or clinical trials that have been submitted with the application. They will then present the application for the panel to consider. And at that point, the primary reviewers and then the panel members may ask questions. They may ask questions such as, how long has this been performed? Where is this performed in? Is it done in an office setting, in a hospital setting? Is it limited to tertiary or academic hospitals? Could it be safely done in a community hospital, an ASC setting, or the like? They may ask questions about, is the training for this something that might be part of what a physician might have learned during his practice or fellowship training, or is this something that they have to go off and get specialized training in order to perform? They may also ask questions about difficulty. They cannot ask questions about cost or things of that nature. They won't ask questions about specific time, but they're trying to learn, how is this different from an existing code or codes, and whether this meets the
Did we lose Joel?
I don't hear him.
I think we might have lost Joel. You can still hear me, Kai, right?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm sure he'll be back in a minute. So a couple other notes here. The Category 3 code is good for 5 years when it's issued, and it can be easily renewed with a simple email in advance of one of the application deadlines. So sometimes codes go on for 10 or 15 years as there's an ongoing need to continue to have them. All right, let's move now. Let's say that you, well, actually, let's look one more time at the process here. So you would apply in February. Then there would be some back and forth with the panel leading up to the public meeting in May. Following the meeting, there would be some notice that these codes are approved. Now, meanwhile, on the payment side, I alluded to this earlier. Someone had a question, what does APC stand for? APC is Ambulatory Payment Classification. It's the payment mechanism that Medicare has for hospital outpatient departments. So CMS is going to be making an APC payment assignment to all new Category 3 codes in advance of the implementation date of the code. So if you apply in February this year, the code's approved in May. Over the summertime, so June, July, August, September, CMS is going to be looking at the appropriate hospital payment to assign that code to. And so you can engage with CMS, you can have meetings, Zoom, they give you a 30-minute Zoom call, you can submit public comments to advocate for an appropriate payment assignment. And then usually the payment assignment is confirmed in advance of the final rule, which comes out in November. So I think a lot of companies may not be aware that there is this other step here that CMS is going to be making a payment assignment. And if you don't give CMS input on the cost of the device or the cost of the procedure, they may make a low assignment. And then you have to try and go and fix that later. So that's on the hospital side. And Joel, I see you're back, so I'm glad we've got you again. Let me have Chaya comment briefly on then what can we do for the physician payment side for the Category 3 code?
So yeah, the physician payment is what's called carrier priced. So that means that there isn't a set payment rate for the physician. It doesn't mean that they can't get paid. It just means that Medicare doesn't set that payment rate. So what you want to do is identify existing codes that are similar to the physician work or the resources, or codes that are already recognized by the payers. And you want to, when you submit the claim, send in this information along with a cover letter and sometimes, you know, any supplemental information that shows how much this procedure is like the existing codes or procedures that already exist. So that really can help them identify how to value your Category 3 code and how much the payers should pay.
Yep. Thank you, Chaya. And Joel, we have a question. What percentage of Category 3 codes have you seen are approved?
Oh gosh, I'd say that in the last 5-6 years or so's time, I'd say that more and more Category 3 codes are getting approved. Obviously, not all get approved, but the approval rate does seem to have climbed, does seem to have increased in recent years.
Good. And many of them can be withdrawn before the panel meeting too, so they're never formally rejected. They may be withdrawn, and then do you count that or not count that?
Well, if a coding application has been withdrawn before the presenters have actually sat down at the table, it is as if the coding application never occurred in the first place.
Yep. Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I can add something to that too. There's definitely some strategy in if during the application process, if you get any feedback from the societies, which that's all part of that process, you can kind of feel the temperature of how your application is going to go. So, if you're starting to get kind of that pushback, or you start to get lots of questions around the code language that you've crafted for your new code, you can pull that back before moving forward with the application.
Now let's pivot to Category 1 here. So we do have the timeline for Category 1 on here, and I admit it does get a little shocking when you see the 2030 decade referenced here. But so we have a relatively quick timeline for Category 3. So you apply next February, you get it January 1, 2026. Then I typically allocate at least 2.5 years. So 26 to June of 28, maybe you could meet the criteria for Category 1, which we'll look at in just a minute. And then that kicks off another panel meeting in September. It's kind of a similar process on the June timeline. But then what's different with Category 1 is then they take a whole year to execute the relative value update committee survey. And that's how they arrive at the final payment assignment for the Category 1 code that'll be published in the Medicare physician fee schedule. So this is about an 18-month, could be closer to a 2-year process as well to go from Category 3 to Category 1. And Teresa, can you back us up one slide? And then Chaya, why don't you walk us through what the Category 1 criteria are?
Yeah, so the first thing that you really need is full professional society support. So it's really making sure that all those relevant specialty societies are backing your code application. You don't want to have a lot of opposition going into a Category 1 application from the societies. You also need to have FDA approval or clearance for your technology. And then the next thing that you need is what's called widespread use. So as John mentioned, that RUC survey that they send out, there isn't like a specific number of physicians that need to respond, but as you can imagine, physicians don't love filling out those surveys. But they need to have a large enough number of respondents to the survey by providers that are relevant to your particular technology. They need enough of those providers to respond to the survey to understand how many providers are using it across the United States and in what frequency. So along with widespread use, the evidence that you need to demonstrate is quite extensive. So you need to have 5 peer-reviewed publications for your technology. You also need to have one of those publications with an exclusive US population, and at least 2 of those studies cannot be overlapping with patient populations. And then the AMA puts this criteria out as far as what is the minimum level of evidence that's required for those publications. And they say that the minimum level is level 2A, which is a systematic review of cohort studies. Ideally, they want you to have randomized control trials when it comes to your evidence.
But that's a good point. So an RCT is technically not required to get a Category 1 code. So Joel, this widespread use thing, I think it drives the industry crazy. And in my mind, that is usually the big delay or explains why it takes so long to go from Category 3 to Category 1. But what's your perspective on demonstrating widespread use?
Sure. So obviously, physicians who complete RUC surveys have different response rates. In order to do a valid RUC survey, however, there have to be a minimum of 30 non-conflicted responses. That means that the respondent cannot be on the payroll, a paid advisor, consultant, have stock or stock options, things of that nature. So if you think about things, a 5% response rate of 600 people will get you 30. A 10% response rate of 300 physicians would get you 30. Sometimes the RUC will allow industry to provide a list of users who perform the procedure. And I'd say that as a bare minimum, that should probably be about 175 to 200 or so physicians. Again, fellows, medical students would not count as being users. But you have to get permission for that. And oftentimes the specialty societies are still asked to do a survey, random survey of their members as well to see do they have familiarity with the procedure and can they opine regarding the physician work of the procedure as well. So occasionally there have been some procedures which have met all the criteria for Category 1, but are very super specialized. Perhaps it might be something like pediatric neurosurgery, or maybe such as a linear accelerator only available in 2 places in the United States. And in those cases, it's recognized up front that they'll never be able to achieve a statistically valid RUC survey.
Okay, great. And Joel, another question on the Category 1 process. How is specialty society outreach different than what we already talked about with Category 3?
Again, same process. Keep them informed, do it early, make sure that they're your partners. Remember that unlike Category 3 codes, which do not go to the RUC, Category 1 codes, if successful, the surveys will be performed by the specialty society or societies, and industry does not have a role in that. They're not able to communicate with people about RUC surveys alike. So it's, again, crucially important to work with the specialty societies, especially as you're going for a Category 1 code.
And I know a particularly problematic request is to modify or update an existing Category 1 code as opposed to going through the Category 3 process, maybe a shortcut, for example. And Joel, I know you've been through this many, many times. What is the society's position on modifying existing Category 1 codes?
Well, John, I think the fairest thing is to recognize, the audience needs to recognize the following. Sometimes a modification to an existing Category 1 code is truly viewed as simply grammar. It really has nothing to do with changing the work and the like. But if you're suggesting any type of a modification that would change the work being reported by the CPT code, that may lead to the code being brought back to the RUC for resurvey. And under some of the provisions of the Affordable Care Act, prior to the ACA, we used to do 5-year surveys and used to do reviews in a 5-year review period. Now, because of the ACA, codes can be resurveyed at any time. So trying to make an editorial modification, which isn't editorial, which may lead to not only that code, but other codes in the family may also be pulled in and resurveyed as well. So specialty societies are thinking about those issues when they hear your request to modify an existing code as opposed to seeing whether new codes need to be developed. And the panel is also thinking about that as well.
And Joel, do you have an opinion on the length of time it takes typically once a Category 3 code is approved to when it could be converted to a Category 1? Is it longer than my example timeline?
You know, John, it depends. I think all of us who've been around the process have seen instances where perhaps a Category 3 code was created, and the following meeting, there is a request to create a Category 1 code. And so it may be less than 2 years from Category 3 to Category 1. On the other hand, we do have some codes that are still Category 3 from the beginning of time, from the beginning of this century, when Category 3 codes were first developed. So as you know, as Chaya said beforehand, Something's going to happen in that 5-year period of time. It's either you've moved from a 3 to a 1, you've requested that that 3 remain for another 5 years time, or you let that 3 expire. But because of the literature and utilization requirements, it's important to have those in place when thinking about how can you compress that timeline from moving from a 3 to a 1.
Okay, good. So I think in the interest of time, let's move along. So Teresa, can you go 2 slides down for me? Now, this is one of the special topics. We have 2 of them that we'll cover briefly, but one of them is called the AI taxonomy that the CPT panel created. I think it's been out, maybe this is the 3rd year now. But Chaya, do you want to give us a quick overview of what this is all about and how this is used?
Yeah, so essentially the AMA was outlining 3 categories for AI technology, so artificial intelligence. And we've been seeing a lot more codes, especially Category 3 codes, coming to the CPT meetings as of recently. And so, the AMA needed some language to be able to distinguish how these AI codes or technology is utilized. So essentially, there are 3 categories: assistive, augmentative, and autonomous. Now, this is mostly what distinguishes these 3 categories are how much the technology is actually doing the work versus how much the physician is doing. So you can see in assistive, the technology is just detecting clinically relevant data, whereas in autonomous, it's actually interpreting the data and making a clinically meaningful conclusion. So you can see they have examples even listed in each of these categories as to where the codes, both Category 3 and Category 1, where they fall into these categories. So, and really, most of the technology that we see is more towards the assistive side. There's really actually one code that has only gotten through to the autonomous level, and that is for retinal imaging. So, the AMA and CMS have been very open about how difficult it has been for them to understand how to value this technology. And so really, it's been kind of a challenge for them to understand how to pay these codes.
Yep. And I guess, Joel, do you have any comments on why the AMA came up with this classification?
So the AMA has had a number of working groups, and this was something that was developed out of one of those working groups, and it's been very, very timely because not only has it provided all stakeholders with appropriate ways of thinking about AI, it's also led to changes within the CPT application itself. So give credit where credit is due, and anticipating that this is a very interesting change in how we are thinking about the use of AI and technology as it affects both physician work as well as the equipment, staff, and supplies of the practice expense needed to provide the service.
Yep, good. Thank you, Joel. And let's see, Teresa, I know we're getting a little bit short on time. Let's go to the next slide. And this was a case study on Heartflow. And Chaya, do you want to just summarize this one really quickly for me?
Yeah, sure. So basically, Heartflow is a great example of how they got Category 3 and Category 1s approved. So they were founded in 2010, got FDA clearance in 2014. In 2018, they got their Category 3 code approved, which did have really good hospital payment. So you can see it was still carrier priced for the physician, but the hospital payment assigned was close to $1,000. And then, they established widespread use widespread coverage pretty quickly. And so by 2024, they got their Category 1 code, which did have even better hospital and physician payment.
Yep. And that's, it's a long-term process. I guess that's maybe one of the takeaways here. But if you stick with it, you can have some success. Okay, next slide. I did want to cover this. These are our recommendations for what a typical work package or workflow would look like with Category 3 and leading up to Category 1. So I started the timeline October 1st of this year, and you can see it assumes you applied for a code in February. So maybe take roughly 6 months or so to get that application pulled together, submit it, then you get your code coinciding with FDA clearance. First quarter of 2026. Then I built in approximately 2.5 years to meet all of the Category 1 criteria, applying at a June deadline 2028. Then it goes that 18-month period with a Category 1 code conversion, if successful, January 1, 2030. So that's kind of the timeline here. Now, behind the scenes, what you should be doing besides working on the applications is you need to have an evidence strategy. And so Category 3 only works if you have strong clinical evidence to back up the device and back up the procedure. I think where a lot of companies get into trouble is maybe they have 510Ks, they didn't invest in any studies, they want to go get a code, they get a code, then they go to the payers and the payers say, I'm not covering your Category 3 code because you don't have enough clinical evidence to meet the payer requirements. So you should have your eyes open going into this whole process here that you are going to be shining a spotlight on your device, on your procedure, on your evidence or your lack of evidence. And it's to your benefit to have a good evidence strategy outlined in advance. So I would say start there. What evidence do you have? What evidence do you need to meet payer requirements? And then, as you're leading up to the launch of the Category 3 code, create dossiers, create a value presentation for payers, create a value presentation for hospitals, get your messaging, your marketing and value messaging down that includes both clinical and economic. That can be part of your launch package for at least Category 3. Then, meanwhile, you should keep your eye on, starting immediately, how can you meet the literature requirements for Category 1? So where are those 5 articles going to come from? Are you going to meet the other criteria? And I guess hand in hand with that goes, how are you going to meet widespread use? So on my timeline here, I have article creation going on up until the point when you're going to start applying for the conversion to Category 1. And honestly, it probably, the whole line should have gone continuously through 2030 on article creation. But then, you need to have a good package ready for that Category 1 conversion, get that submitted, and then you'll have another round of dossier and value presentation creation in advance of the Category 1 code launch. So that's the evidence side. I mentioned this earlier, you do need to be aware, you have to go meet with CMS and comment to CMS about the APC assignment for your Category 3 code. So you can do that, leading up to the go live date for the code. And then also it's probably a good idea to monitor it during the next rulemaking cycle. And the same thing is true on the Category 1 side. You'll need to be in there talking to CMS, making sure that this new code is also appropriately assigned an APC. Now, to support your Category 3 code, a best practice is to have a patient access program. And that's a toll-free number staffed by certified coders and other billing experts. It has a web portal. It's a way of a manufacturer directly supporting physicians and patients who are getting the device. And it's a good idea to have that program stood up and ready to go when the code goes live, so that then if your customers or your surgeons or your physicians are having any kind of reimbursement trouble, you have a place to send them. The program can help appeal denied claims, can help with get prior authorizations approved, can answer basic questions about how to submit this code, things like that. And so a best practice is to just have that program in place indefinitely, through and beyond the conversion to Category 1. And that will support a case-by-case approach to getting Category 3 approved. Secondly, you also need to be looking at outreach to payers. And here we have a service we call payer engagement, where we have some dedicated experts who do nothing but profile and then reach out to different payers and advocate for coverage. And again, that depends on having good quality clinical evidence to make the case for you. If you don't have the evidence, this isn't going to work. And then finally, you're going to want to support your sales force to make sure that they have messaging around the launch of the Category 3 code, and again in the future around the launch of the Category 1 code. So that's a sample workflow. It's more than just getting the code. It's getting the code and then having the infrastructure in place to ensure that you're continuing to drive utilization and adoption on the payer side as well as on the provider side. Okay, next slide. So just a few takeaways, and then we'll have time for Q&A here. So, as I think you've heard us allude to, a Category 3 code is not without risk of failure. If you get it, it's not guaranteed that it's going to solve all of your problems. And as I just said a minute ago, you have to have good clinical evidence for this to be successful, because you are stepping out into the spotlight with a new code. Every payer is going to look at it and they're going to say, why should I cover this? You have to have a response to that. If you don't, then it's going to be a struggle. Now, we did talk about opportunities with Category 3 codes. One opportunity is if you have the option of using existing codes, but you also potentially could get a new code, and the existing codes pay too little. Well, through the RUC process, through the APC assignment process, you have the opportunity to go get higher payment when you get a new code. You can get that payment potentially customized to the cost of your device and your procedure. If you stick with it and if you have the clinical evidence to support it, that can be a great way to go get premium payment. You can also use the Category 3 code to differentiate your product from others in the broader category. If you can get a code that's maybe not exclusively, but maybe more directly identifies your code versus competitors, that can be a way of getting out of their coverage policies, perhaps getting a fresh look, getting a fresh start. So a Category 3 code can be a valuable tool in product differentiation. And then finally, as we've emphasized here, it's not a quick process, but dedicated, continuous, relentless effort can lead to success over time, and again, backed up with the clinical evidence to prove it. Okay, so that's the end of the prepared material. We do have a few minutes here for Q&A. And let's see here. I've got a list of ones that have come in. Let's see. Are there statistics on the percentage of current Category 3 claims that receive some kind of Medicare payment? So I don't know, Chaya or Joel, do you guys have any thought on that?
I'd actually refer the individual to looking at the article that Josh Macauer and his colleagues from, at that time, Stanford Byers, now Stanford Musselman Center, published in JAMA last year, which looks at the fact that it takes over 5 years on average for technology go from FDA clearance to some form of payment or coverage or coding.
Okay. Next question. Is there a risk of private payers writing non-coverage policies for Category 3 codes as experimental versus pursuing an unlisted code? So, I mean, I think an unlisted code is the worst of all worlds, because providers have to submit even more detail about what was actually done versus when you have at least a Category 3 code. The payer knows what's being done. So the claim submission burden is less with a Category 3 code. And actually, Chaya, do you have you may have a thought on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a risk. The payers are constantly looking at this new technology, and still they can create a policy at any point that says it's experimental. But the unlisted really is even less desirable in that they're just that is meant to be a temporary solution for coding. There's no way to track it, and there's no way to understand, what that procedure actually is. So it's better to pursue a Category 3.
Okay, just moving along here. Joel, can anybody request changes to an existing Category 3 code?
Anybody can submit a request to CPT.
Have they ever modified Category 3 language, or do they just say, we'll just leave it till, it comes up under Category 1 later?
I can think of some recent examples. For example, there was an ophthalmology procedure where there was a request to successfully modify the description of the Category 3 code that more correctly reflected the actual physician work being performed.
Okay. All right, next question. Is there a pre-submission process like with the FDA? I guess I would say not like the FDA, but you can do your society outreach before submitting an application. You can also submit your application, get some feedback from the panel if they have questions, and then decide to withdraw it if they don't like it. So one thing, I'm not sure we really talked about this in too much detail, but after you submit the application, leading up to the public meeting, the panel staff and panel members may have inquiries on the application. And sometimes you can tell, ooh, they don't like this application or they have big problems with it. Then you can withdraw. But I guess, Joel, I know you have good guidance on that. You want to go over that for us?
So again, to just clarify what you said, there's no pre-sub process, but communication with the specialty societies is so important in having an application successfully submitted.
Yep. Let's see. It says it seems many are not able to go get a Category 1 code. Is this accurate? If yes, what is the next best strategy?
So I think, again, we've seen an increasing number of Category 3 codes over time, and Category 3 codes provide a good mechanism for identifying the procedure, identifying utilization, and building the evidence strategy to eventually move from a 3 to a 1.
Let's see. Do manufacturers play a role in the bundling of CPT codes into APCs or DRGs? Well, at the end of the day, CMS is going to do what it's going to do. You can comment. You can meet with them. Often they have windows of the year when they're open to Zoom meetings. They will give you a 30-minute Zoom meeting where they invite, maybe they have 12 people on the CMS side, some coverage people, some coding and payment people, and they will cut you off at 30 minutes too. But you have a chance to make the case. Usually if it's payment assignment, then we're talking about what is the actual cost. So if you have cost data or cost detail from a clinical study, for example, sometimes you can collect OR minutes or what were all the supplies that were used or things like that. You can build up from nothing. Here's an estimate of the cost and show that to CMS. Invoices, if you have device invoices or something like that, that's even better. But you can give input. They have rules for where they can map and not map. If it's too cheap, they're not going to put it in a higher paying APC or DRG. But just be aware you can give input. But at the end of the day, there are no guarantees on that. Okay, maybe one more question. Let's see. All right, this might be a fun one. What are the implications when specialty societies do not agree? That's a good one. Joel.
I'm laughing because I'm just thinking about that's daily life. No one ever agrees in everything. Everybody disagrees in so many things these days. I think what I'm trying to say with that is that when one society says yes and a second society says no, what I think the applicant has to decide is Is that enough to say pull and withdraw? Or is that enough to say, let's continue on in the process and let's see what other advisors say, let's see what the panel members say, and the like. There's an old saying, no doesn't mean no, no just means not right now. So it's always better to have an open line of communication with all the stakeholders and to see how whether pursuing and proceeding is in everybody's best interest.
Excellent. Thank you, Joel. Thank you for being our special guest. Thank you, Chaya, for joining. And thank you to our audience. Look for our follow-up email, and also note that we do have a compliance webinar coming up next month, October 23rd. So thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your afternoon.